a little bit more than an hour going through the PowerPoint slides, and then we will have time, plenty of time at the end for questions. If there's a burning question that you would really like to have answered, go ahead and make a note of it, and we'll do it as we start. See, I've got to make sure. There you go. These are copyrighted materials. Feel free to copy them for yourself. Basically, I'm just hoping that you won't disseminate this stuff because there's some things borrowed from other folks and also from Wiley & Sons, who's the publisher of Building Codes Illustrated, who would not like it if the things got reproduced too widely. We've already gone through that information. Basically, what I'm going to talk about today is when and when not to use the State Historic Building Code or the California Historic Building Code. I'm going to talk about how it interacts with the basic California Building Code and how the use of the code can be beneficial for qualified historic buildings. We're going to focus today on the fire and life safety provisions of the Historic Building Code and how they differ from the basic California Building Code and the existing building code. I'm going to talk some about how to validate the fire resistance of so-called archaic building materials, things which are in place which may or may not match the construction materials and techniques that are found in current construction, but which form an integral part of the historic fabric of the building. I'm going to use what I think are sort of common historical building terms, and I'm hoping that you're familiar with things like historic fabric and that sort of thing, because I'm not going to define every term, although we are going to spend some time delving deeply into specific definitions from the Historic Building Code, because they have great bearing on how you proceed to use the code. I'm also going to talk about where there's a strong crossover in the means of egress system design between the existing building code and the current building code and the historic building code, where there may be a number of deficiencies in the historic building that don't meet current code, but you need to have a yardstick against which to measure those deficiencies so that you can talk about how to mitigate them. What we're not going to be talking about today are a couple of other large aspects of historic buildings, not because of their lack of importance, but simply because of a limitation of time. One of them is the provisions of disabled access. There are specific pathways under the Historic Building Code which are different than those for existing and new buildings for provision of access by persons with disabilities, both in terms of just straight renovation and also major alterations or additions to a building. So that's a course in itself, so we're not going to be talking about that. The other thing is, while I am a civil engineer, I don't practice as a civil or structural engineer on a day-to-day basis, so that we're going to touch a little bit on some of the structural aspects of the Historic Building Code, but we're really going to talk more about fire and life safety and means of egress in terms of materials and architectural layout. The other thing that, just to lay some groundwork, there are three sets of documents we're going to be referring to today. The first one is this California Historic Building Code. The other two are the California Building Code and the California Existing Building Code. The Building Code and the Existing Building Code are based on national model codes, which are developed by the International Code Council, so that the 2016 California Building Code is based on the 2015 International Building Code, and the 2016 California Existing Building Code is based in part on the 2015 International Existing Building Code. And we in California adopted only a portion of the existing building code in order to replace Chapter 34, which was the familiar location for all of you who've used the code in the past, for existing building provisions. There was always a Chapter 34 in the IBC and subsequently in the California Building Code that dealt with existing buildings. In the 2015 International Code, Chapter 34 was eliminated in favor of putting all existing building provisions in the existing building code. So California had to adopt a portion of that in order to get the basic prescriptive provisions of Chapter 34 into the California Code. The California Historic Building Code is a completely homegrown document. It was developed in the 70s and has moved forward since that time as a document that we'll talk a little bit about its purpose and intent to facilitate the preservation and reuse of significant historic buildings, designated. The other thing I think most of you know, you don't have to rise to the level of being on like the National Register or a National Trust building, that if you have registration or recognition at the local level, you are eligible to use the Historic Building Code. But those of you who practice in other states or have come into California, the Historic Building Code is something which is going to be a totally new animal in terms of what you'll find in the rest of the country, because as I say, it's a completely homegrown California document. There are lots of changes in the International Building Code and the existing building code because of the ongoing 3-year update process. On the other hand, the Historic Building Code has actually been a very stable document. Since it was first published and went through a few iterations in the 70s and 80s, there have been very minor additions and renovations to the code since that time. So I think there's only a couple of minor editorial amendments in this version that went from the 13 to the 16 code. So one of the good things is that when you get used to finding things in the Historic Building Code, you're probably likely to find them in the same place in the next code cycle, which is not always the case with the existing building codes. Here's kind of a parallel comparison between the language of the Historic Building Code on the left and the California Building Code on the right. And basically, codes in general, including the two or the set that we're talking about here of the California codes and historic codes, are really the minimum standard set meant to safeguard public health, safety, and welfare, dealing with strength, means of egress, stability, disabled access, lighting, sanitation, etc. You know, the codes grew out of fires and things during the 1800s, and every time there was a major disaster like the Iroquois Theater fire where people couldn't get out of a building, you ended up with things like out opening doors and panic hardware. So that the codes grow by accretion and their responses to conditions of danger or health, safety, and welfare. The Historic Building Code has the same health, safety, and welfare underpinning, but it also is to provide regulations that facilitate the preservation, restoration, and rehabilitation or reuse of existing buildings. So it recognizes that those existing buildings have been there for a long time and have been historically doing, in most cases, a very good job of meeting the health, safety, and welfare needs of their occupants. But that as they move into the current time or they get reused, that they need to be re-examined to see how the current code thoughts about health, safety, and welfare fit into the historic building. The use of the Historic Building Code is an interesting document or interesting pathway choice. The use of the code is an alternative, or it's not really a completely diverse pathway between using the Historic Building Code or using the basic building code or the existing building code. But it's a choice that's made by the owner of the building and their design team to analyze the building, if it is indeed historic, to be able to and eligible to use the provisions of the Historic Building Code to see whether there is a benefit to the building itself in terms of preserving its historic nature and its historic use, at the same time meeting the contemporary needs of health, safety, and welfare. So the historic building code use is a choice. Once the choice is made, the language in 8-101.2 says that the historic building code requires enforcing agencies to accept solutions, but that are reasonably equivalent. That you can't simply come in and say, I'm using the historic building code and I'm going to check that box and I'm going to go off and do anything that I feel like doing. It's something where, and we'll talk about this in more detail later, it's something where the use of this code involves a dialogue, a very active dialogue between the authorities having jurisdiction and the design team and the owner. And we'll get into that in much greater detail as we go forward. There's no intent statement in the California Building Code. There's the purpose, which is health, safety, and welfare and preservation. But it basically, the intent of the historic building code is to facilitate preservation and continuing use, but it's also providing reasonable safety for the building occupants. And reasonable is a very flexible definition applied on a case-by-case basis and a situation-by-situation basis within a particular building. So that it's always dangerous to reason by analogy in any kind of building code discussion of, saying, well, I saw this at the building down the street, why can't I do that here? Or how did they do that? Because I didn't think that was possible. That happens even more in historic buildings, is that the application of the historic building code is you take the basic framework of that code and apply it in a kind of part-by-part analysis of how that fits in with the existing code, so that it's going to be a very customized solution. There's no cookie-cutter solutions to the use of the historic building code. And reasoning by analogy is that you did it with the historic building that you just worked on is going to be absolutely, that's the wrong argument to make, because the buildings, there's no two historic buildings that are even remotely the same. You do get into interpretation issues. The illustration on the right is something that is in the book that I did with Frank Ching, that basically you have the intent of the code. Someone writes a code section trying to solve a problem. And then the interpretation of that is done by the building professional, the authorities having jurisdiction, the contractor, all of the people who are dealing with taking the language and turning it into something else, so that then the interpretation of what the intent of the code is comes out to be a lot of different things. It's like that game of rumor where you tell us, everybody sits in a circle and tells a very short story, and then the next person gets the story from the person before, and when it comes back around the circle, it's a totally different story, because every time someone retells it, it gets subtly changed. Well, that happens with the code. That basically the notion of what the intent is reasonably equivalent, health and safety and welfare. The question of what that means in terms of that particular building is going to be something which is going to be very much open to interpretation and discussion. Discussion is key to the use of, I'd say the most fundamental thing that would be to take away from what I'm talking about today is that dialogue is the key to the successful use of the historic building code. The other thing that's interesting about codes in general is that you take an issue like when you need two means of egress from a space, or whether you can keep the rise and run on a historic stair. Then that issue gets written into language. The language that gets interpreted by the design professional and expressed as a drawing. The drawing is then turned into the authorities having jurisdiction, who look at the drawing and reinterpret that graphic language and the notes on it back into their own language, compare their intent, their interpretation of the language with the language in the code, and then you get a plan check comment. So it's amazing about how things get garbled when you're doing something like that. It's not surprising. The terminology that we're using today, I've already talked about this, but I'm going to reiterate it. The CHBC is the California Historic Building Code. It's found in California Code of Regulations on the Title 24 bookshelf in Part 8. Physically, where it's located is you have 2 volumes of the California Building Code. The second volume of the California Building Code has Part 8 and Part 10 in the back. Part 8 is the California Historic Building Code, and Part 10 in the back of Volume 2 of the Building Code is the California Existing Building Code, and that's the California Code of Regulations, Title 24, Part 10. And what we're talking about, the Historic Building Code, is the basic code that we're talking about today. What the CHBC calls the regular code is referring to the other 2 building code documents that might be applicable, which is the California Building Code and the California Existing Building Code. And when I'm talking about this, and I couldn't resist, I had to do it in this slide as well, I call the Historic Building Code the Let's Make a Deal code, because it basically is something where you're going to have negotiations, dialogue and negotiations over the application of the code. That you need to compare the existing building provisions to your historic building to see what the regular code would require. You're also probably going to be using the building code, even though it applies technically to new buildings. You're going to be, the real means of egress discussion and fire and life safety, fire protection discussions are contained in the California Building Code as well. So you need to end up looking at all 3 documents. But basically, what you're going to do is to see what the basic code would require you to do, and then what alternatives or mitigations are necessary in order to bring up certain deficiencies in the historic building, using the Historic Building Code to make it bring those deficiencies closer to what would be required if you were applying the regular code. That cannot be done in a vacuum. You cannot simply apply the Historic Building Code and turn in a set of documents for plan review, because the plan review would be completely undone by that documentation, no matter how well you did it, if there wasn't something that went before it. So that the assumption of using the Historic Building Code is that there's going to be ongoing dialogue starting early in schematic or even conceptual design to make so that the design professional gets their head wrapped around the needs of the owner to see how you do that work, and then figuring out how to express that or sit down and talk about that early in the design process with the authorities having jurisdiction. Authorities having jurisdiction is just a shorthand version of saying all of the folks who give you a permit. In the case for most buildings, what we're really talking about is the building department and the fire department plan reviewers. You may find that AHJs, again, AHJ is this short version for authority having jurisdiction, that AHJs may be wary of applying the Historic Building Code because they may not have a lot of experience with it, or they may have had experience with what they perceived of as design professionals cherry picking aspects of the application of the Historic Building Code to having to apply basic code provisions. That's one of the things that design professionals need to be very cautious about and very transparent about with the discussions with the AHJ, is that you can't, if you take a path, you have to kind of stay on it. You can't kind of jump on and off or jump over fences. Once you've set one path, you need to kind of stay there. You can use the Historic Building Code, but you have to be very wary of your own instincts to cherry pick pieces from one code to the other. But the basic thing is the intent, coming again back to the intent of the Historic Building Code, is to promote reuse of historic buildings without destroying them while you're trying to bring things up to the current code. And there may be cases, and the Historic Building Code covers this, there may be cases where the building's been abandoned. It simply has been unoccupied for a number of years and it wants to be reoccupied. That could be seen as the same use and occupancy as previously, or a change of use or occupancy under the existing, under the regular codes. And the code is designed, the historic building code is designed to promote that. But there may be other cases where, and we'll talk about this in some case studies, where you're inserting new uses into the existing historic building, which those new uses drag existing building or regular code, building code provisions back into the historic buildings, so that you don't get a free pass for putting an assembly space in something which was not an assembly space before. So you have to be very cautious, particularly about alterations, changes of use. Additions, there's always new construction, so there's no issue about that. Some owners that I've worked with are often reluctant to, if they have buildings which are eligible to be landmarked under whatever landmarks regimen exists in their jurisdiction or their locale, may sometimes be reluctant to landmark the building because landmarking it may take some time. It may have to go through another commission, like in Berkeley, it would have gone through the Landmarks Preservation Commission or other agencies in different jurisdictions. So that some owners may see the time it takes to landmark the building as slowing down their project. They also, because they may not have used it, may not see the benefit of the historic building code in terms of the preservation aspects. Often owners are not as interested in preservation as you would like them to be, so that sometimes you want to make, as a design professional, particularly if you're interested in preservation planning and architecture, is make a case for using the historic building code, because you're going to do less damage or violence to the building and still get the owner what they need. But because it's an owner design team decision at the beginning to use the code, there's oftentimes a dialogue at the beginning with projects that are eligible but not landmarked of whether to go ahead and do that. And not every owner is going to go ahead and opt for do that. So that may be something you need to build into your schedule about having that discussion or even that designation to see whether the cost benefit for the owner works out for that as if you're a design professional. This is my recommended, the recommended analysis process that I'm going to walk through here is pretty much the same that I would do for an existing building that is not eligible for the historic building code, or even a brand new building. So that I'm recommending that you don't short circuit any of your basic code analysis processes because you're using the historic building code, that there may be things that you end up not having to do or do differently under the historic building code than you would under the regular code, but you need to make this a systematic analysis process. The other thing about doing this is one of the things that will allow you to have a meaningful dialogue with the AHJ. So basically, every building has an occupancy. It has a use. The owner wants to do something with it, so that you need to figure out what the occupancy classification is. Determine why the building will be sprinklered, because it will be sprinklered. As we'll talk later, the sprinklers are the first big move in any historic building. And we'll talk about what NFPA sprinkler system to use. You want to see how the historic building code gives you some leeway in construction classification if you use sprinklers for mitigation. But you do need to think about how the building would be classified if it were done under the regular code or if it were built anew, so that you can deal with additions and things of whether you're going to need firewalls or how you have opening protection on exterior walls. And then the other thing is you need to look at means of egress systems. And my first take on the means of egress system is always using the basic building code to look at the building for travel distances and common path of egress travel and ratings and things like that of corridors, or just look at that under the new code and see where those any deficiencies arise that you may need to remedy, either with the historic building code or with new code provisions. Alterations the definitions in this discussion are ones taken from the historic building code, and they're sometimes more than subtly different than the ones in the regular code. So you need to look at these You don't want to regulate by definition, but you definitely, for using the historic building code, every time you use it, make sure that you reread the definitions to familiarize yourself with what the terms that you're applying under that code. Alterations, basically at some point you start doing too much work, and even if you're not making the building bigger, the alteration level may be such that as part of the discussion, someone's going to say, time out, this is no longer a historic building. You've blown away too much historic fabric, so we're going to go back to the regular code. This is a key determinant for the AHJ. A distinct hazard is I'm going to just clear and evident condition that exists as an immediate danger to the safety of the occupants. They need to be remedied. And basically, there are certain things which remedy distinct hazards, but it needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. Like a stair which is too steep for rise and run, if it's an 8 and 9 stair, may not be a distinct hazard, but if it's a really steep stair or it has irregular landing lengths or irregular riser heights, may be a distinct hazard such that it's hazardous to move around it. And even if it's qualified under the historic building code, may be something that the AHJ could determine that stair needs to be remedied because it's a distinct hazard. The regular code is what we talked about, is using the building and existing building. New work, new rules. If you do extensive alterations or you're adding on, then those are going to be done under the current code. Rehabilitation, it's basically you're fixing the building up to do something else with it while you're preserving the features that give it its historic character. And again, this is the distinction between reuse, rehabilitation, renovation are case-by-case discussions, but it again comes back to that key word of discussion. Repair is a different definition and quite different than what's under the historic building or the regular building code. It requires renewal, reconstruction, renovation of any portion. It's not about the repair for maintenance or even the new definition of repair to repair damage. Repair means, in this case, fixing things in a historic building that might have deteriorated due to age or lack of maintenance, so that it's meant to be a much broader definition for its continued use. Uses and occupancies. The historic building code allows reoccupancy of a building without triggering all of the requirements of and changes of use without triggering requirements. The existing use, regardless of any period of time in which it may remain unoccupied, that if it can be made to conform to the other provisions of the historic building code, you can reoccupy the building. The other is a change of use or occupancy under the regular code triggers new code provisions for things like means of egress, fire and life safety. That's not automatic under the existing building or the historic building code. Such change in use or occupancy shall not mandate, basically over here, shall not mandate conformance of new construction requirements as set forth in the regular code. So this is saying, doesn't say what you have to do, but it says you don't have to do everything as you would in the regular code. The first big move in historic buildings is always sprinklers. And it's an automatic, fully automatic sprinkler system, complete throughout the building. There are a number of buildings you'll find under historic building conditions that are things where they're partially sprinklered, or they're systems which you really don't know what the provenance of the supply or the size of the piping or anything. It really, what you need to do is to put in a new sprinkler system. But that's going to be the first big move in most every building, even small historic buildings, because you get so much benefit under the historic building code for sprinkling the building. It's also, what it recognizes is that fully sprinklered buildings have a very, very good fire and life safety and property protection record in new and existing construction and in historic buildings. The sprinklers allow the reduction or elimination of necessary occupancy separations, which can be an issue in existing conditions where you might need separated occupancies. If you sprinkler the building, those 1 hour walls are not necessary. You can keep the existing building area as is. Heights and areas can remain historically the same in historic buildings if the building is sprinklered. You can get out of 1 hour construction and 1 hour corridors. The 1 hour corridor is less important under the current code because there are far fewer places where the current international building code and California code requires 1 hour corridors. It also, if there are distinct hazards for fire that are identified by the authority having jurisdiction, they oftentimes, and we'll talk about this in the case studies, will allow the provision of sprinklers to mitigate the distinct hazards. Owners and architects sometimes, especially of significant historic buildings, can sometimes balk at the provision of sprinklers, but sprinklers can be very unobtrusive. You have recessed heads with flat covers, and they can go into very historic interiors with minimal intrusion. You do have to do some cutting, or you've got to get behind the ceiling. This is a new construction, obviously, in the photograph, but you have to get behind the ceiling or above it to get the sprinklers in, but you can do it. And here's an example. This is the entry lobby of the War Memorial Veterans Building with a very, very nice, smooth, very large arched plaster ceiling, which is now fully sprinklered, and it has cover plates over the sprinklers. And even if I blew this picture up, you would not notice the sprinklers unless you were lying on your back trying to count them. Same thing here. This is the green room in the War Memorial Veterans Building, which all of the finishes were redone, but now that space is fully sprinklered, and it's completely unobtrusive. One of the things, the recommendations that I'm making on a couple of projects I'm working on right now, and I've done in the past, there are 3 basic NFPA sprinkler systems. There's 13R, 13D, and 13. If you have a tall building, you must use 13. You can use very small buildings, you can use 13D. 4 stories or less, you can use 13R in any type of building, even if it's not residential, which is what the 13R system is designed for. NFPA 13 provides full protection for small spaces, interstitial spaces, those sorts of things. It's designed for life safety and property protection. It's the highest standard. There are other sprinkler density standards, but between the 3, there's 13 is fire, life safety, and property protection. 13R is life safety only. It basically, you have some elimination of fire protection in some attics and closets. It has full life safety protection, and it also has lower water flow requirements. And then 13D is for life safety for 1 and 2 family dwellings and very small historic buildings. I recommend in most cases that even in small, medium-sized buildings that you price an NFPA 13 system, because there is a provision in this section that I'm citing right here, up here in an exception, when the automatic sprinkler systems are used to reach compliance in 3 or more occasions. You go from 13D to 13R or 13R to 13, so that basically if you're going to sprinkler the building, in almost every case, the design team is going to take every advantage, and rightfully so, they're allowed to under the code, of using the sprinklers, so that you're going to hit that 3 checks of using the sprinklers very quickly. So that in terms of insurance, life safety, property protection, even when you get to the thing where you could go from 13D to 13R, I would say just make the jump and go to the full-blown 13 system. Construction type classification. They're the same sets of classifications in the old days. You're going to find much more masonry and unreinforced masonry, or just wood construction and that sort of thing. But as far as classifying a building in the 2 combustible, for the combustible parts, which is 3, 4, and 5 construction, or non-combustible, which is types 1 and 2, you should be able to classify any historic building as a construction type. Construction type in historic buildings or alterations or renovations has the same set of ground rules. Is that basically you get increased fire resistance and cost as you go to the left on this chart from type 1, you get decreased number of occupants and stories and areas and heights and things, but also lower cost as you go to the right, going from type 1 to type 5. The other thing is if you can classify the existing building, historic building, as having a construction type, you then know what the ground rules are for additions. That if you're adding on in and you have some additional area left over, you can make additions without having to have a firewall. Whereas if you want to make different, deliberately different construction for historic differentiation reasons, or for area or for heights, you're going to need a firewall, because firewalls are what allow the possibility of having mixed construction types. Basically, exterior walls and openings, where you get into cases where there are openings that are too close to other buildings. This is another place where sprinklers allow you mitigation. Three-part means of egress applies in historic buildings as for others. There's basically the three parts are the same. There's exit access, which is where you do what you're doing in the building, which also includes corridors. There's an exit, which is a protected exit passageway. It's a vertical enclosure, or the last door out of the building if you have a single-story building. And then exit discharge is that path of travel or length of travel that goes from the door out of an exit to the public way where an exit discharge ends. Those three parts can still be applied in every historic building as well. And basically what you need to do is start looking, because the building is sprinklered, and I'll give you the reasons, there's a lot of reasons why you're going to do that. You can take advantage, or you should take advantage of the provisions for sprinkler building requirements in terms of common path of egress travel distances, exit access travel distances, exit doorway separations going from half the diagonal to a third, and corridor ratings are lower in certain buildings based on whether the building is sprinklered or not. So, but you should analyze the building as if it were brand new in terms of looking at paths of egress travel, because these may disclose places where in large historic buildings you may find places where you feel like you're going to need an enclosed, add an enclosed exit stair if that can be done sensitively in a historic building, because you simply don't have exit access travel distance. Like on the Oakland City Hall, that has a high-rise portion by even today's definition, 15, 16 stories. That tower only had a single means of egress, so that we inserted a second fully compliant exit stair into the corner of the tower, so that there are now two means of egress for every floor in the tower, and we were able to do that with minimal disturbance on the exterior. We also had this hollow clay tile on the inside of the existing stair, and we strengthened that stair. And there are certain provisions in Chapter 8-5 in the means of egress which allow you to do, doors that are too narrow, particularly you have double doors that are less than 6 feet wide. You can do an uneven leaf where you would have a 3-foot exit door and then just a fixed or a small side leaf. Stairs not meeting the current rise and run criteria are not automatically dinged under the historic building code, and that's important to look at, because in most cases existing stairs, especially open ones or decorative stairs, are a crucial part or a very important part of the historic fabric in most historic buildings. So the code, historic building code, gives you a fair amount of leeway in dealing with those historic stairs. But this is one of the things where you need to look very carefully at the conditions of the stairs, the balusters, the handrails, and rise and run, especially the regularity of rise and run, so that you and the authorities having jurisdiction can have a discussion or a dialogue about whether those stairs create a distinct hazard. You don't necessarily need to re-swing entry doors. that because it's very difficult to change the door swing on some large decorative doorways on the exterior of the building, which would have a major historic impact, I would recommend doing that if you can. If you can re-swing doors to swing in the direction of current code, egress travel, that's always a good choice. And you don't necessarily get a pass for doors other than entry doors, reading 8-502.4. You can, railing and guards that are not compliant with the regular code may remain under 504 if they're not a distinct hazard. And there needs to be, those need to be looked at very carefully. Here's an example of a stair, a winder, which actually had a very low occupant load, which is one of the things that allowed things to stay in place. This is just to acquire loft, which is not used all that frequently. It has very low railings on the side. It also has a baluster, which is much wider than 4-inch spacing. That what you need to do is to kind of look at the physics of these sorts of stairways to see whether the railings and are tall enough so that the center of gravity of a person would not topple over the edge, so that you're not creating, again, that goes through the distinct hazard. The other additional safety provision here is the addition of a brand new handrail up against the wall, which is fully compliant with the rise and going up at the proper angle for the rise and run of the stair. So it allows people to stabilize themselves going up the stair without having, and physically takes them away from the lower interior. This is an ELS job at a church that basically, if you look in carefully at this up here, there's a small set of pipe rails at the upper level. They're set back a foot or two from the lower balustrade, so that it's more like an assembly space, the railing that you would find in a current assembly space today under the regular code, that allows people to use the choir loft without having a fall hazard. Also, again, this building is fully sprinklered with very little impact on the historic finish. The other thing about this building is a lot of the finishes you can see were removed, especially at the walls, where new lateral force restraint systems were put in, so that you can take out historic finishes. We did the same thing at the City Hall in Oakland. You put in concrete shear walls and then replace the decorative materials over the new structure. This archaic building materials are buildings which basically may or may not be used today, and particularly things like unreinforced masonry and that sort of thing, but they are an integral part of existing buildings, and you need to figure out at some point what the fire rating, or there are structural provisions in 8-8, but they don't deal very much with fire resistance. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. The intent of the Historic Building Code is to allow the reuse of historic materials, and that you can infill or replace in kind with historic materials. It's meant. This is so this is in the front of the book, but it's basically solutions provided in the CHBC or other acceptable regulations or methodology of design and used in whole or in part with the regular code, or with any combination of the regular code and the CHBC, shall be allowed. It's basically telling you this is the roadmap that you can mix and match, and you're encouraged to do so, but you have to have this in a dialogue with the AHJ. All three of the codes, the regular code, the historic existing building and the California Building Code, and the Historic Building Code, allow calculations for fire resistance and materials without fire tests. And they're based on a set of rules developed by fire protection engineer T.K. Harmathi in the 1960s. And they're discussed in the following slides. And I'm not trying to turn you into armchair fire protection engineers, but it helps to be able to have a dialogue with the design professionals depending, no matter what side of the counter you're on, having a dialogue with design professionals or authorities having jurisdiction to talk about mitigations. And basically, Harmathi's principles, which I'm going to go through very quickly because we need to keep rolling here, but they're intuitive, but they're also really useful things to know. The first one is that where you have layers, the sum of the layers is greater than the individual parts. So that T1, T2, or T1 might be greater than T2, but T1 and 2 is greater than the individual parts. The second one is if you have an existing set of construction and you add a layer of something, like let's say you have plaster wall and you put 5/8 chipboard on it, intuitively and fire test-wise, but also by these rules, the addition of that additional layer increases the fire protection. It's maybe difficult to think exactly where the fire protection rating was, but let's say 2 layers of 5/8 on a 4-inch stud could be a 1-hour wall. If it's got another 3/8 or 3/4 inch of plaster in there, it's not going to be less than an hour. It's probably kind of, by observation, going to be more than an hour. The addition of the provision of an air gap, where you have a continuous air gap inside of 2 layers of fire protection, increases the performance because it slows down thermal conductivity between the fire face and the other face, between one side of the other, so that the right-hand wall with an air gap has a higher fire resistance than the left-hand one. The fire side matters in terms of, this becomes very important in shaft wall construction, of where you're trying to protect, you're assuming that you're not necessarily in an egress stair going to have a fire inside the stair, but you're trying to protect people so they can get out of the building. So that there is in various uses, the side that's exposed to the fire determines the performance. That having an air gap and making the air gap bigger doesn't really gain you anything. That having a 1-inch and a 2-inch thing gets you a few minutes of, or not even that, very, very few minutes of increased protection. So having an air gap matters, but making it bigger doesn't really get you much. There, again, between low conductivity, and this is in terms of fire, low and high conductivity has a fire side impact, depending on what side you're on. You can go back and look at these at your leisure. I'm not going through these in great detail, but it's worth knowing. This is what the calculated methods that are in 722, and we'll talk a little bit about where to find ways to do this in the existing building code, which is not in California, but I think is a good alternate means proposal. Asymmetrical construction, thin layers and thick layers and various conductivities, again, has a fire side component. Things that have some moisture in them, if they're going to, will burn less slowly or less quickly, but you need to make sure that the air is not going to become something, or the moisture as it expands actually blows the wall surface apart. You need to make sure that you don't get spalling in a fire if you're counting on the moisture in the material to slow down the fire spread. Individual pieces like beams, and this is the same sort of thing as the basic wall principle of aggregating materials, that individual elements are going to perform worse than aggregate performance. You can also substitute, in this case, you could put in a concrete reinforced beam for an existing beam. You could put this beam over here with the same slab, and that this assembly, when it has a slab on it and other things, is going to perform better. You could test this as a new construction element. And if you've got an hour, you can be assured that when you put that in place, that this assembly is going to perform at or better than an hour. The building code and the existing building code have calculation methods. It's enshrined in 722 in the building code. One of the interesting things when I went back through this is how hard it is in the 16 code to read this. The beginning charging language of 722 occurs about 6 or 8 pages in front of the rest of the document, because there's a table inserted in there which has nothing to do with the chapter you're looking at. It's really confusing. But hang in there and make sure that you put the two parts together, because looking at the physical code will confuse the heck out of you. The calculations in 722 make the use of the component additive method, which is part of the Hermathes principles. The other thing is if you're working with even archaic building materials, particularly with new ones, each of the materials organizations that represent concrete, masonry, steel, wood, each of those industry organizations have very, very good contemporary and archaic materials information about the fire performance of their material. If you ask them about fire performance of their competing materials, they'll also be quite happy to tell you why their material is better. There is in the existing building code, which is not adopted except partially in California, in the whole international existing building code, there is an appendix called Resource A, which is based on a study done by the National Institute of Building Sciences in the late 80s. It's called Guidelines on Fire Ratings of Archaic Materials and Assemblies. It was last updated by HUD in 2000, but it's a goldmine of information about archaic building performance. And I gave you it's free. Take a look at it. It's got great information about, it amplifies or is a good adjunct to the calculation methods that you're going to find in 722 in the basic code. Here's an example of one of the archaic materials guidelines. These are actually some of the hollow clay tile that we found in the Oakland City Hall. And basically what this tells you, depending on how it's laid up and the thickness, that in this material, you should count on it as being 1/3 hours, so that a wall that has this hollow clay tile in it has a 20-minute rating. So if you need a 1 hour, you're going to have to add other materials, fireproofing or gypsum board or some other thing that has a known fire rating quality to get you from the 20 minutes up to a 1 hour wall. This resource is not part of the existing California existing building code, but because 722 uses it, I think that in those cases where you can't mitigate requirements strictly by sprinklering, this is a good system to propose to the authorities having jurisdiction as a basis for an alternate means and methods request. This is a case study from the War Memorial Veterans Building here in San Francisco in the Civic Center. It's the companion to the Opera House, built in the 30s. The uppermost level of the building had originally been a museum and then had been converted to offices when it was made City Hall after the Loma Prieta earthquake, so that it was supposed to be converted into an assembly space for the opera at the top story. And therefore, the authority having jurisdiction said that the last use was a B, and we were changing the use to an A, which actually a fairly large assembly occupancy. It even needed a main exit and other things, so that the AHJ was not comfortable with treating that corridor as an existing condition, and they thought that it needed, we all agreed that it needed to be 1 hour rated. The building was fully sprinklered, so that we were using the historic building code, but this 1 hour requirement was in addition to the kind of overall 1 hour mitigation that we got for the existing building, because this was a new use. So again, this was the negotiated, the deal that we made with the building and fire in San Francisco. So basically what we ended up doing was, here's the section, this is the arched 1 hour ceiling, the assembly space is over here. This is all the interstitial space was used for mechanical distribution. The spaces, all the occupied spaces were sprinklered and the building. But what we decided is that this needed to be 1 hour rated. What we found is that the corridor wall was a hollow clay tile. We actually found for the tiles that were used in this building a 50-minute rating in the NIBS Archaic Materials Guide, which the AHJ allowed us to use for validation. And then there had been an additional 1 layer of gypsum board added during the remodel of the offices, so that in the aggregate we had about an hour and 15 or an hour and 20-minute wall. So that wall was acceptable as is, as a 1 hour for the corridor. The arch above it was a 3-coat plaster on metal lath, and looking at the archaic materials, kind of interpolating between a couple of different systems, we all agreed that it had a 35-minute fire rating. So what we ended up doing is sprinklering the interstitial space of the attic above that with a sprinkler density that was more akin to an occupied space rather than a back of house or an attic space, so that in combination of, if there's a fire up here, it would be extinguished by the sprinklers. We had 35 minutes of rating in the space. ELS did the same sort of thing at Lister Hall at Mills College. They had a rating mitigation discussion. I think this was with the City of Oakland, if I recall, and they ended up rating the getting additional rating by sprinklers in the attic space, in addition to the sprinkling of the main space. In the California Theater in San Jose, ELS Architects needed to provide a 1 hour rating at a mezzanine, which was adjacent to the main hall. And what they ended up doing in that situation is there was a 1 hour vertical assembly and a 1 hour ceiling. This is looking at, this is the concession space, which is next door to the mezzanine space. And then they had a stone counter and a 1 hour piece down here, so that this is a roll down shutter, so that they were concerned because there's actually food service and cooking equipment back in this concession area. So they wanted to make sure this was the likeliest spot for a fire, is to make sure that if there was a fire in the concession space, that it would be prevented from getting into the public walkway. And that was something where the building was fully sprinklered, but this was something where, because of the projected reuse and especially the insertion of new concession counters, because that was all new construction as a renovation, then that was the negotiated decision of how to deal with that addition. And this is what that condition looks like in real life. Oops, I went back to one, excuse me. Basically, here's the doors. These are the concession counters, and there's roll down shutters, and the 1 hour was up above. The other thing you can notice is this building was also fully sprinklered, and this one has exposed heads. These are actually, these dots on the ceiling are the sprinkler heads, and even though they're not, there was no attempt to recess them or make them fall back into a recessive position in the very significant architectural ceiling. They're a very unobtrusive intrusion into the historic fabric. So that's the end. I think I'm going to, I'll see if there's any questions, and Jonathan can open things up for that, whether people want to write things down, or not quite sure how we do this.
Great. Thank you, Steve. We have plenty of time for questions here, and just so one came in, just a reminder to people, if you'd like to ask your question in person, I'm happy to enable your voice, but you would have to raise your hand so I know that you're interested in asking in person. Otherwise, you can type your question into the chat box or the Q&A box So while other people are thinking of the questions they'd like to ask, I'll just present to you the first one. Somebody's asking, would a historic building that is being relocated onto a new foundation and subsequently mothballed until a future use can be determined, would that be required to be updated to not quite sure what this means, but would that be required to be updated to CHBC standards, or is this an AHJ question or determination?
The answer to the AHJ is always yes, it's an AHJ determination, because, going back to the notion of the let's make a deal code. But if I recall, I don't have this, obviously I don't do things from memory any longer in the code because there's just too much to remember, but the relocated building, if it's a qualified historic resource, could use the historic building code. I would say that because you're building brand new foundations under the building, that would come under the current code in terms of bearing pressure and lateral force restraint and all those kind of things. That's again, new work, new rules. But as far as, even if you're going to move the building and reuse it, I think you could use the California Historic Building Code. The danger or the difficulty with mothballing the building is that you have essentially the duration of the application of the building code that you got permitted under, that you can do the work and mothball it under the current code. But if you come back, even 180 days if you let the permit lapse, but certainly if you came back, say 5 years later, and were under the next edition of the California Building Code or the California Historic Building Code, you would need to go back and re-examine that the building for code compliance with the code at the time that you're taking out the mothballs, kind of, that when you're actually working on the building, you would have to re-examine it. As I say, the historic building code's been very stable in terms of not having major changes. And there are some editorial changes even in the historic or the historic building code that haven't had a material impact on technical requirements. So I would think if you did it under the historic building code that you would probably not be too far afield. But if you came back after the mothballing and wanted to do something totally different, then I think you're back in the negotiation business. But certainly, as far as, I think this is a perfect example of, you don't just turn in a set of documents that says we're going to do this. This would be something where you're at conceptual design or schematic design. You sit down with the authorities having jurisdiction and you have a very frank and dialogue. The one thing you don't want to do is building officials rightly don't want to be they don't want to, I'm a code consultant, and the building officials don't want to be your code consultant because that's not their job. But basically what you should come in is with a clear set of statements about what you intend to do, because that allows the authority having jurisdiction. You're not playing 20 questions at that point. That allows the jurisdiction to respond to a firm proposal of what you have in mind, and that statement can then be accompanied by reasons for why you're doing what you're doing, so that it isn't a question and answer session. It's more like, here's what we're proposing to do. Is this compliant? And we think it's compliant for these reasons. Do you concur with that? And then you can have a dialogue about where you agree or where you disagree. It isn't something about where you're each trying to read through the code and figure out what you're doing. You make a clear statement, and then you get a response based on that statement.
Okay, thank you. Another question came up. In trying to utilize the SHBC, we sometimes have stumbles with it really being historic. Has there been any better definition of qualified historic building? We sometimes have trouble finding a definition acceptable to building officials. We've used SHBC since first approved. It was easier in the late 1970s.
That's an interesting question, and that's again varies all over the map from, in California, whether it's northern and southern, urban and rural, you're going to get different takes from different authorities having jurisdiction. The thing that most owners think about is, I think that they think that the bar for historic designation is very high, in terms of they think of, well, I'm not on this National Register or something, so I can't, I don't have a historic building. But there are a number of avenues in various jurisdictions for designation. The more formal it is, sort of the easier it is, in terms of, like in Berkeley, there's a formal list of designated buildings. And that if you're on that list, then you know that you would be eligible to use the historic building code and probably not get much pushback from the EHJ. But if you start pushing the envelope of designation of where the designation is not something where the designating agency is not recognized by the authority having jurisdiction, then you're liable to get some pushback. I mean, I think that where it's kind of like most historic structures are in the eye of the beholder. That they're pretty much not too much argument, but there are some buildings where the historic nature of it can be in question. The other thing where it actually gets to be more of a problem is where you have a recognized historic building, or one where no one would have any argument about whether it might be considered historic because of its age or its historic use, is whether it's been trashed, of whether it's actually been renovated out of historic status. That might be something where, but that's one of the questions where, it might have been designated and then somehow lost its character, where somebody might push back and say, well, this is so far down the road that we don't consider it historic. That's actually more likely to happen than trying to designate a semi-historic building where somebody might not agree with you.
Interesting. And maybe that that final point that you made follows on a question that we received here by email from somebody prior to this presentation. There's somebody in a city who did a rehabilitation, I would call it, of a historic building that prior to the rehab probably would have lost so much integrity that it wouldn't be considered historic, but then they rehabbed it and received a certificate of appropriateness from the city, saying that it looks like it qualified as historic. And then the fire department comes in and says that they need to comply with the 2016 codes, and even though the building official had signed it off in 2004. So, it seems like there's two different determinations by two different reviewers. And how would you reconcile something like that? Would you have to go to the appeals process? And you didn't talk too much about appeals, but maybe you can kind of describe that in your answer.
It's an interesting one. One of the things that I always recommend, this is not the same case, but I'm going to give a long answer and I'll come back to it, I promise. One of the things that I recommend for new and historic construction is that when you have a meeting, that's why I use the term authorities having jurisdiction rather than the building department, is that when you meet with the authorities having jurisdiction, it's authorities plural, and it always includes the fire department. In terms of any discussion you have about any building, particularly because of the enormous fire and life safety implications of the reuse of existing buildings, of how much leeway you get for sprinklers and where that leeway ends. That you want to make sure that the dialogue, that the people in the room having the dialogue are all there at the same time. And that includes the building and fire department. It might include the preservation officer if there's some question about the provenance of the building or something. But anybody who's going to give you a permit that might come back and say that you might get a different answer from should be present at that discussion. The question if I understand it correctly, is I'm not sure what would trigger the need to bring a building up to the current code, especially if it had been permitted or reused in 2004,
Mm-hmm.
because that would have been the weird thing, or not the weird, but the thing about building codes or fire and life safety issues is unless you go do something to the building, change the use, change the occupancy or something like that, or you have a gross deficiency that's exposed during a fire inspection, then you don't have an obligation to bring a building up to a current code absent any work in the building. I mean, no one would, we would tear down the city of San Francisco if we had to do that. But at the same time, if you find something where you're doing something like the ghost ship warehouse or something where somebody's grossly misusing a building, then that's something which is a fire inspection. And that obligation to bring the building up would be based on the question of an imminent hazard or a distinct hazard,
Mm-hmm.
where somebody's created something that needs to be remedied right now, or we're going to red tag your building.
Right.
That's different. But to come in and say, well, this building was okay in the past, and you now need to bring it up, I would have to see what triggered that comment. I don't know, because just walking into the building, that's not a comment that I would expect a fire official to make.
Right, right. Okay, well, that's a great answer. Thank you. Another one came in from Stephen. Stephen is asking, in attempting to make bathrooms accessible in a historic building, is there any leeway that can be considered such as the required 5-foot distance between the nose of a toilet and the front wall? Say the best that can be accommodated is 4 feet 10 inches.
That's one of the reasons we didn't talk about access in this, because that's another hour or two. The short answer is no. That particularly maneuvering clearance, things like door push and pull clearances, you can mitigate with operators and that sort of thing. You could, even if you didn't have sufficient room in a space, you could put the lavatory outside and if it had clearance. But basically, there is not the same level of mitigation, particularly when you're dealing with maneuvering clearances, which are based on wheelchair clear maneuvering. That one of the things in that situation would be is if you can't make that particular toilet room accessible, is provide a new one somewhere else or in another location, so that you can certainly maintain historic conditions if you can provide an alternative location for accessibility. But the problem with that, or the thing you always need to keep in mind with dealing with access, and so we're going into access, even though I didn't promise to do that. The fundamental thing to keep in mind about accessibility is its foundation, especially since the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, in civil rights legislation, which has to do with equal treatment. So that basically, if I'm able-bodied and I can walk into that 4'10" bathroom and maneuver around and do what I need to do and get out, and the person who's in a wheelchair goes 100 feet or 200 feet to get to an accessible bathroom and rejoins their companion 10 minutes later, that's not an equal access under civil rights legislation. So, I mean, if you could put in a new toilet room next door to the old one, that's pretty close to equal access. But it's you get into this on site work where you have steps and ramps, where some person in a wheelchair has to go a long way to get down 3 or 4 steps. But the short answer to the original question is, what I say about access, including historic buildings, if you think maybe you have to provide access, you do. Still out there?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I don't see any final questions now, but maybe we'll hang around for another 30 seconds or so. And while we're waiting for any final thoughts or questions from people, I'll just mention to people that in your chat box, you'll notice there's a link to a survey And every webinar we do, we ask that you please do leave us feedback on today's program. I'll send a summary to Steve, and it does help us improve our programs as well, and also make any suggestions for future programs. So if any questions came up that you don't think were addressed, that's a great suggestion for a future webinar. So let us know what kind of programs you want to see in the future. Another reminder while we're waiting for anything else that may come up is that our annual conference is coming up on May the 17th through the 20th this year in Palo Alto. So encourage you to go to our website, take a look at the conference page, and think about registering. The final date for close date for our hotel block is coming up in 3 weeks or so here. So be sure to make your reservations early. What else? Nominations for the Preservation Design Awards are open now. So if you, we'll make the link available on the front page of the website very soon here, but if you look up the nomination page, you should be able to find it. If you go to californiapreservation.org/awards, that should take you to it. And we do, every year we recognize sometimes 12+ projects across the state of California. And if you have anything in mind, everything from rehabilitation to reports to restoration to reconstruction to contextual infill, there's plenty of categories to apply in. So we encourage you to look into that. And finally, please do become a member. Your membership helps us provide programs like this, and we're primarily an education and advocacy organization. And without your support, we can't provide programs like this. So encourage you to do that. There's also a question that just popped up. It's not related to today's program, but he was just asking if this webinar is available online. We do make the recording available later, but it does come at a nominal extra cost. So if you're interested in that, just let me know, and I could set you up with a link to watch the recording. So again, thank you, Steve, for coming in today and presenting this wonderful presentation, and appreciate your time and effort. And do you have any final words?
Yeah, I just, looking at the sign up sheet, or what we thought is it seemed like there was folks on both sides of the counter signed up to do this, in terms of folks who are from authorities having jurisdiction, as well as design professionals, or maybe other planners and even building owners. So, I tried to balance it in terms of not talking about one side or the other. I'm a design professional and I consult with that, but in terms of, I think that going back to the basic, if I'm going to leave any takeaway, is that this really is the let's make a deal code, and not in a pejorative way. It's something where it's in everyone's interest to preserve historic buildings in a safe way, and you don't get a free pass by using the historic building code, but it's based on the assumption that the folks who are working with those buildings are going to actively talk to each other about how to make those buildings stay useful and stay safe. Thank you.